I'll send you the link by email.
Okay, yeah.
And we are actually live. But I'll send it to both of you as well. And so if you can just post.
Yeah, I can do that.
Yeah. I'll send you the link by email.
Okay, yeah.
And we are actually live. But I'll send it to both of you as well. And so if you can just post.
Yeah, I can do that.
I'll send you the link. Okay, cool. All right, we are live. Good evening if you're in Thailand, Malaysia, Indonesia, Singapore, Burma, Cambodia, and the whole of Southeast Asia. Good afternoon to you if you're listening from Europe, and very good morning if you're in USA. This is a FORSEA dialogue on democratic struggles across Asia, and we approach knowledge production and the universities as a part of a struggle for human freedoms that rest on human understanding of our own predicament wherever we are. And I have a very distinct pleasure and honor to host two of my old friends and colleagues, Professor Thongchai Winnichakul of the University of Wisconsin at Madison, and Professor Michael Chaney at the School of Oriental and African Studies in London. Before I introduce them properly, let me just abuse my moderator position to share a couple of key points that I think underpin our discussion. Although we are looking at states as institutions of power with tremendous influence over society, economy, culture, and of course, education at all levels, what we are fundamentally talking about is basically the linkages between institutions of power, whether it's the Catholic Church or Buddhist monastic order, or the secular liberal regimes, economic organizations such as corporations, and political states, what the political scientists and students of our society call states or governments and institutions, and the education. And so I think this is actually perhaps a perennial issue that have troubled many free thinkers, intellectuals, artists, and creative workers and whatnot, going back all the way to the ancient Greece, the ancient India or Buddhist time, the Nalanda University that was founded in the 400 AD to Bologna in 1088. For instance, in Bologna, the students of what we call today Italy at the time in 1088 AD, that's like 1,000 years back, they tried to engage in what we would call independent studies. And then the church, the Catholic Church, moved in and offer the facilities. And then, before the students knew, the church was attempting to dictate the parameters of intellectual discussions and discourse. And then bring it all the way to colonial Burma or not colonized Thailand. The universities, modern universities, have been, quite integrally linked to the Western powers, a colonial project of creating subject people and shaping their perception, accepting their lot within the colonial order. And now, just recently, Yale University and National University of Singapore had ended, particularly from the Singapore side, ended their 10-year-old experiment with NUS or Yale NUS Liberal Arts College, one of a kind in the region. And that triggered our concerns looking across the increasingly authoritarian Southeast Asia and how these authoritarian regimes are reshaping and redefining what students learn, what they talk about, what kind of courses they offer, and what kind of publications that universities are publishing. So without further ado, let me invite Professor Michael Chaney first, before giving the floor to Professor Winachaku. Mike is one of the foremost historians of Southeast Asia and Asia, and particularly his focus is on my own country of Burma and military histories. And he earned his doctorate in history at the University of Michigan in 1999. And he spent his career at the Center for Advanced Studies, National Singapore University of Singapore Institute of Advanced Studies on Asia at the University of Tokyo. And he has been a professor with the School of Oriental and African Studies for the last 2 decades. Mike.
Hi, thank you, Zarni. First, I should say something about the background to my own take on all of this. I wrote my comments earlier in the year on Southeast Asian universities on the occasion of Pavin's contracted book being rejected by the National University of Singapore Press, and then Pavin's call for a boycott of the press afterwards. And at the time, I was concerned with how it fit in the big picture of Southeast Asian higher education, what I had experienced myself working at a university in Singapore for 2 years, and what I had seen of other universities in the region. I was interested in how this fit into longer-term dynamics and how this behavior was not new. It was consistent with the experiences of other academics in former colonies, including Africa in the 1960s with the Asquith reforms, and why this would also be true of Thailand. I was also interested in how this reflected on the decolonization of knowledge and challenging Western knowledge regimes that maintain colonial control through enforcing in all kinds of ways, Western hegemony. To get to the end of a long journey, I found it useful to highlight the role of the colonial era foundations of Western-style universities as tools of the state per se, designed to provide colonial economies and societies with resources like doctors, technicians, and administrators, but not to create critics of the state, not to create dissent. I think where I differ with Thongchai, who's one of the other speaker today, what he had written in 2019 is that in that piece, at that time, he normalized the free critical thinking of the university and saw the anti-university, quote, anti-university was the term he coined for that, as a newer development fostered by the increasingly anti-democratic state in Thailand. So much so that all universities in Thailand, he saw at the time, or sees today, or in 2019 at least, as anti-universities. I think we agree on a number of things. One of them is that the university and society are bound to one another, and the intellectual health of the university is dependent on the intellectual health and freedom of society. My view is that states have always tried to try to control universities, to use universities as a producer of resources that the state and the economy can use, and not to allow the university to become a source of dissent. The problem for the state effort in this regard is that the more democratic the government, the harder it is for them to do this. And so in such societies, students and interested publics can create counter spaces within the university. The more authoritarian the government and the less democratic the society, controlling the curriculum is easier to do. So during the current shift towards authoritarianism in Southeast Asia, what we've seen across the board in Southeast Asia is a retreat of democratic liberalism. We see that states have an easier time shutting down these counter spaces to silence dissent. This was true during the 1930s and under the military rule from 1962 in Myanmar. A good example, you remember from a number of years ago, was the military's efforts to decentralize the universities and disperse students to different campuses around the country, specializing in different things. I suspect this is actually what is happening with Yale and US with the recent news that they're closing in 2025. They'll close Yale and US, but they officially, of course, have attributed this to strategic restructuring. What is significant here, though, is that according to the reports we've received, there was no consultation with the major stakeholders. It was just done by the executive. Because I view so much agency in the state closing these counter spaces, I found useful insight from James Scott's thinking about state space, in which some terrain is easier to govern, thus it's state space, and some physically difficult to administer, and hence non-state space. And for Scott, this project is directed at making physical spacing legible to the state. Trying to keep knowledge focused in the way the state would like on producing resources without dissent, I have borrowed from Scott and called this statethink. Again, all states try to do this, not just those in Southeast Asia. It was not so long ago that there was talk about ending area studies funding in the United States because it had been used not to produce strategic advisors for the United States military and State Department, but had instead led to the production of numerous anthropologists and political scientists who were actually critical, and very vocally critical, of U.S. foreign policy. And the United Kingdom, the government here, I'm pretty certain, and this is backed up by decisions on funding, that they would love it if universities focus entirely on STEM subjects and vocational education. The governments can cut funding for certain subjects, but they can't actually close the counter spaces in universities because of the potential public reaction. In the US and the UK, more liberal democracy means enforcing state desire unilaterally is easier to contest and oppose. In Singapore, by contrast, more authoritarianism means it is easier for those in the intimate bond between the state and the university administration to do what they wish. There's no problem of any kind for the military junta in Myanmar to do this. Or in Malaysia, where academic staff swear allegiance to the sitting government and not to the constitution, and have to seek university permission to speak on any controversial issue. Now, I would love it if I could come up with an easy overlap with the decolonizing debate, which I also write about, but I haven't been able to do it with this particular issue yet. The reason that we often find post-colonial universities in this predicament is not the same reason that we have the problem of the continuing hegemony of Western academic structures globally. So national prestige for universities is derived in part by pursuing Western gauge metrics, and this reinforces the primacy of Western academic journals published by major Western publishing houses in Western languages like English and French. Importantly, it's mainly universities in former settler colonies like South Africa who are taking the lead in pursuing decolonizing because they have democratic pressure to keep the counter spaces open on university campuses free from the closure of the state. More broadly, the problem because of the lingering colonial governmentality of post-colonial states in which popular democratic pressure to counter state decisions, how far a government is prevented from making unilateral decisions without fear of losing its control in the next election, is insufficient. Yale NUS was introduced at a particular time, I think, when the prestige of Yale was capturing everyone's attention, but then protests from Yale stakeholders led to concessions in the charter to allow for more academic freedom to be extended or guaranteed than perhaps had originally been imagined, at least on the Singapore side. This came to the fore in September 2019 when, after Yale NUS president Tan Tai Young canceled a week-long university course on modes of dissent and resistance in Singapore, as well as a workshop on protest placards by Yale NUS a few weeks before it was about to be taught. There was a lot of complaint about the move, violating the guarantees in the school's charter. This was after Tan Tai Young had reportedly consulted with the government and was warned by the Ministry of Education of the dangers of going ahead. According to news reports, the decision to cancel was made because participation might subject, quote, subject students to the risk of breaking the law and incurring legal liabilities, which was not acceptable to the college committed to operating within Singapore laws, end of quote. It was claimed that the workshop on protest placards might violate Singapore's Public Order Act. According to this act, quote, public assembly, even on campuses, can be illegal if used for political means or if organized by or involving non-Singaporean organizations or citizens. There was also reportedly concern that the activities and some of the speakers who had been proposed would, quote, infringe on our commitment to not advance partisan political interests on our campus. Now, flash forward 2 years later, and Yale NUS is being closed. Liberal arts may continue in the new school, but I wonder how far academic freedom will be allowed. Of course, the decision to end in 2025 apparently would be pushed through, despite complaints by the major stakeholders. By contrast, Duke NUS Medical School, which focuses on medical training rather than critical thought, will very likely go on and escape what's being called strategic academic restructure. Now, I'm going to finish this in my comments and hand this over to Tongchai, but I should mention quickly that thinking about this as a state and society issue and not only as a colonial issue makes it possible, I see it as making it possible for me to not exceptionalize Thailand to include it. And as Tongchai has mentioned to me, he suggests that there's no need to do this at all because Thailand fits in the larger model. Thank you very much, and I'm passing this to Tongchai.
Yeah, the Tongchai Ajahn, allow me just to interject because I want to introduce you properly. Mike, that we'll pick up on the issues, a lot of thematic issues that you raised during the conversation. First, Professor Tongchai Winichakul is Emeritus Professor of History at the University of Wisconsin at Madison. I knew him since I was, a youngish student back in early 1990. And let me just repeat this. Tongchai is really a trigger Thai scholar that made me re-examine my typical Burmese racism towards Thai people. And so I owe him a great intellectual debt to make me a better person. I don't think he was aware of it, but being raised in Burma, we were the very anti-Thai, and I assume the same goes for a lot of Thai students and Thai people as well. And so it's really a pleasure to have him here. And his research interest are in the intellectual foundations of modern CM under colonial conditions from 1880s towards 1930s when Thailand was made constitutional monarchy. His book CM Map has become a classic, the geobody of the nation. And then the latest book that he wrote was very much based on his firsthand intimate understanding of brutal events that took place in 1976. The Tongchai studied at Thammasat University. That's where he did his first degree. And then he returned there to teach as a lecturer before moving to Wisconsin in 1991. And he wrote a book, the latest book, Moments of Silence, the unforgetting of the October 6, 1976 massacre in Bangkok. It was published, I believe, by the University of Hawaii Press in 2020. He also wrote Asian Studies Across Academies in the Journal of Asian Studies in November 2014. And he is a very respected, the public, the critique of Thai policies, societies, and politics. And he has published 8 books in Thai language. So without further ado, Professor Winichakul.
Thank you. Zani, call me Tongchai. He's here.
Yeah.
Let me start from saying I read Michael's piece on state think about university, state think and counter space. I like it a lot. And for today, I try to follow his lead, adding comments here and there. Let's say, first of all, let's get the minor thing out of the way. I don't think my anti-university piece, that piece was written in Thai in 2016 or early 17, I don't remember, but translated later. It was it was at that time, many universities, including formal administrators, chancellor, rector, whatever you call, and deans, led students and government and university employees to protest the elected government and help paving the way for the coup in 2017. I think at the time, I wrote that piece not because I normalized Thai University as free space. No, as you see in a moment that how I see Thai universities. But I think that moment that the late university people, employee and students and faculty out in the street to try to help ousting the elected government is unusual, is the worst among the worst. So that I think it is too much to, I mean, we can have criticism of universities all the time. I don't think Thai University is exceptional just because Thailand was not formally colonized. I think I told Michael before we start this conversation that don't worry, in my view, Thai higher education, higher education in Thailand is a legacy of colonial education. Partly because I don't think the notion that Thailand was not colonized we have to rethink. In fact, in the field of scholars Thai studies, we have started rethink that about 20, 30 years already. Anytime we talk, we have to say it's not formally colonized. What does it mean? It means that it was colonized to some extent, in some form, in some ways. Higher education is one of them. Anyway, so that piece I didn't try to normalize. I tried to yell at them that this is far too much, worst of the worst already. Now, what is the worst? I think higher education is not exception because it's colonial education for sure. How do I see that way? Its foundation is from the state, like many other colonial education. I mean, like many other higher education university in colonies, except that it doesn't serve the colonial state. It serves the absolutist state. It serves the authoritarian state. But they are similar in the sense of, I mean, when you see university, this is not my opinion, when you see universities and state relation, how close or how independent they are, we can see from a number of things, such as look at the formal structure, power structure between the state and university. Look at that closely, you find that university in Southeast Asia, Thailand is not exception. Look at Indonesia, look at Singapore, Malaysia. The power structure in between university and the state in these countries are much closer in the sense that the state have more say in university, or put it the other way around, university is less independent from the state power. It's more direct link. It's easy to say. Then you see the power structure within the university between the chancellor or president or rector, whatever you call, and the deans and the non-faculty. See the regulation, how they grant promotion, how they grant tenure, how they grant, let's say, even the regular increase in the salary, how they punish, how they control curriculum. You see the regulation in university, you see that the control in Indonesia is very tight. Whether or not they are conscious of control, but the structure is there between the state and university and within universities. This is far different, as far as I understand, from university, even public university in the US or state university in UK or Australia. It's still different. Then look at what else? Funding. Look at the funding from the state to the universities. In Southeast Asia in general is still pretty high. still pretty high compared to, let's say, the public university in the US or compared to the UK. I mean, even I'm not sure during the time of before the neoliberal phase, but right now it reduced. In Thailand, Indonesia, I don't know other countries, but I suspect that it's similar. It's still pretty high. Once you have that kind of funding, which funding, it means that an indicator is not directly translated or imply that the state have full control, but it is a link. It depends on other factors that I'm going to mention. Then how to control the curriculum. Not only the regulation, how the university can control it, the state policy. The state policy, the institution called Ministry of Higher Education, Ministry of Education, or whatever, how they have control. I think, again, Indonesia, in Thailand, it's pretty much tighter control. Within Southeast Asia, Singapore, in fact, in my view, comparatively among many countries in the region, I think higher education in Singapore, they control differently. The regime control is different from other countries. Other countries such as Indonesia or Thailand is more direct, or Malaysia. It's more direct, it's more overt. It's clear. In Philippines, I don't know much. That's another thing interesting to see. So control curriculum, what should be promoted, even what should be or what can be allowed. It's easily for the state or the top administrator of university can intervene. Far less decentralization, far less decentralized power within the campus, and far less decentralized or independent between the university and the state. And the last thing, I add a little more about curriculum. For example, look at Indonesia in the past few years. Everywhere you go, you heard the word STEM. That's direct guidance, that's directive from the state. In Thailand, they just restructured a few years ago. Now every university is under the Ministry of Education. And if you look at that, it looks similar to Australia some years ago. But in fact, it's another version of control. And it shows that the state has much control. It doesn't mean that the state suddenly want to abolish all the courses or curriculum that's not related to industry. But let's say it shows that the state have much intervention or have much say in which way university would go. And then through the university council or regents, and then through the executive, chancellor, rector, or whatever, then down to the deans, down to different department and faculty. Now, the last thing is culture and politics. This is not regulated, but I would say that this is how I see the beginning of higher education in Thailand. When we say that the state, put it this way, I doubt if today the state or even the civil society look at the university and then see the mission of university is to produce a citizen, I think perhaps the state for sure, but perhaps the society too, look at university as part of the state to produce a workforce, to produce people for the growth, for the economic growth, for the well-being of the society. I don't think university is citizen-oriented that much. When you compare to the Western societies, you can say the state want to control, as Michael say, I wouldn't disagree with that, but I would say the difference is in the degree. That's always true, but I don't, maybe there could be other ways to characterize the relationship, but let's say that's how I think right now. Different is far different from university in the West that at least you can, is citizen-oriented. And the state knows too that they have education is a kind of welfare. That notion, I'm not sure, is true in Southeast Asia in terms of post-secondary education. It, or even education overall, even K to 12. They see it as a welfare. They see it as a mission of the state that provide education and get the hand off. No, I think K to 12 education in many countries in Southeast Asia, in the mindset of the state and the society, see it as a tool to produce a good, meaning obedient citizen. I doubt that that idea, that mentality has changed so much. I start from here. I have something more to say, bits and pieces, such as I don't know much about jail in US or what happened. I just follow the news. A lot of things unclear but very suspicious. I only can say one point which is clear and obvious. It's a fact already, and Michael mentioned that. The decision is made by executive. The stakeholder, they were not consulted. That's already bad. No university, no advanced university in the world would do that. Definitely no way. And that raised a red flag. That raised a lot of suspicion already. And in Singapore, as much as I can say that, relatively speaking, it has more independent, it is more independent, has more freedom to do their curriculum compared to other Southeast Asian countries. I have to say that compared to that.
Yeah.
Yet, in terms of control by the state, I'm not sure it's so much different.
Yeah. Can I just come in and comment just very briefly, and then invite Michael to, offer his reactions to what Tong Chai had said already. Firstly, I totally agree with the Tong Chai's take on this issue, because we are looking at basically the differences, perhaps obviously very significant differences in degree, but not in kind, insofar as the linkages between institutions of power, whether institutions of money that can, philanthropic organizations and whatnot, as well as the state funding, and how that shaped the directions of research, as well as the outcome of research, right? If you, both of you are very familiar with the growth or creation of area studies, say Southeast Asia, for instance. This was created out of the U.S. Communist containment policies. Yeah, the area studies programs became bastions for the producing knowledge that will combat the attraction of communism, the leftist and progressive movements and whatnot. And in my own country of Burma, one of the first things that General Ne Win came to power in a coup in 1962 was basically to radically reform the entire education sector, not just higher education or colleges and universities, but all the way down to preschool and elementary schools and other grade school, to reshape the curricula so that the Burmese could be turned into what they consider socialist cadres, because the education became the primary tool to advance the socialist reform. So because the Tong Chai talk about creating democratic citizens and obedient though they may be. So that's one thing. The other one is Mike. You talked about the academics and institutional practices within formerly colonized societies, be they Southeast Asia, South Asia, or Africa, or even Latin America, that perpetuate this old colonial, Western dominance in the area of both the political economy of knowledge production, as well as the ways of knowing. You talk about the Western matrix to measure academic output, to consider certain things to be legitimate, prestigious, and others to be street and non-academic, right? Can you comment on the particularly the second or the latter aspect, how the academics in Southeast Asia might be reproducing this, the Western hegemonic position. Yeah, so I mean, like the Yale NUS is actually an ironic thing, because NUS was going to Yale for higher prestige and higher institutional standing, right? That in and of itself is basically a colonial act perpetuating Yale dominance, rather than developing NUS as an independent, progressive entity, right? It's just one example. There are so many across the region.
Yeah, that has to be the world's longest question, Zerny. What I would say is that there is an emphasis. This is all part of a complicated. There's a complicated interrelationship between all this, and part of this is an emphasis on form over content. So they want the prestige and the high-profile aspects of being associated with Yale, but they don't want to also bring in the relationship between democracy and university education that people in Yale would see as essential to in the U.S. to university education. So this is where part of the emphasis on the metrics comes in, and of course, and I guess this is where we can bring in decolonizing, and the obstacle here is that as academics in Southeast Asian universities, let's just focus on NUS right now or Singapore, as they try to meet all of these superficial goals of getting into the highest rated journal that's based in the West and appealing to the audience, the referees who are all usually Western, often white academics in Western universities, they wind up reproducing this very colonial knowledge that in which the West is primary and downgrades third world or global South agency and eschews third world non-Western methodologies. So in that way, it does reinforce the colonizing of education and the Western knowledge regime. And this is part of again going down to what some of the universities in Southeast Asia do. They try to get the superficialities of high prestige without getting the meat, the role of universities in Yale, Harvard, not just elite institutions, public universities generally in the U.S., in producing good citizens.
Right. Tongchai, how do you assess, say, the leading institutions in Thailand, Thammasat, Chulalongkorn, and others, in this context of basically playing the instruments, the vehicles for state agenda, the kingdom's agenda, and also in places like Thailand, and if I'm not mistaken, like Burma as well, of course, you've got a lot more intellectual space than the Burmese academics would have, but nonetheless, the university professors and lecturers are considered civil servants. That's a very key issue, right? And the same in Malaysia, Brunei, I've worked in those places as well. And so, there's a very clear managerial chain of command. Chancellor, the ultimate decision doesn't lie with a chancellor or a rector. That's why, the NUS president, Yale NUS president, like that Mike mentioned, had to consult with the government, and the Ministry of Education said, certain things like teaching a course in dissent, or teaching the history of placards, right? For instance, they needed to be cleared with the state authorities, whereas in fact the academic freedom has to be in the hands of the chancellor, right? And of course the body of faculty members, right? And so how do you assess, Thai higher education, practices within this context? We are not just talking about NUS Yale, because we are more concerned about the broader linkage between the states and university educations across Southeast Asia. Gongchai.
I try to think fast. I'm not sure I can speak or explain a bit systematically. Let me try. Yes, Thailand, Indonesia, Malaysia, as far as I know, universities, teachers, professors, lecturers, they are basically government employees. In the past, until late 1960s, most faculties are from government bureaucracies, because most higher educated people serve in different departments of university. Different department of the government. So early on, before late 1960, almost 100% of the teachers or professors are government bureaucrats. Since the late 60s in Thailand, in other countries, I don't know the exact period, but I found, as far as I know, similar process. They started late 60s, they start very late. They started to hire full-time faculty who are not linked to the government bureaucracy. That's pretty late, right?
Yes.
So think about the legacies of that in terms of regulations, in terms of mentality, in terms of mindset. And given the environment that university is never independent in funding, in the structure, or even the mindset, in the culture, the society's culture, the state culture. So your question, to respond to question, I give you this background, because I would add one more thing. In Thailand, there is a campaign, there is a process try to take university out, make university more independent. This started in the 1980s. As far as I see now, new generations of faculty, of teachers, lecturers are not formally government employees, are not bureaucrats. They are just employees, sorry, not government bureaucrats. They are not within the structure, formal structure of the part of the government agency, but they're hired by universities. Okay, but the regulations, if not worse, it's the same. It's the same. So how they behave within this environment, they're still very much under control of university administrators, which is pretty much under the control of the Ministry of Higher Education, which is part of the state. Funding, formal structures, and many other things, you can see that, as I said, the state never think of university as independent educational functions for citizens. They think about it as a state mechanism, K-12 as a state mechanism. And again, I repeat it, I wonder if the civil society see differently. Of course, they are distant. They are democratic-minded people, huge number already, but let's say basically that's a dissent, that's a counter. That's a different thinking from what has been fundamentally in the countries. And I believe, as far as I know, a few other countries, similar. So even Thailand now, compared to Indonesia, Malaysia, in the past 10, I think 20 years, new faculty become university employees, not the state employee directly, but controlled by university. We get the funding from the state, so they're pretty much the same. As it happened, given the so-called neoliberal environment in the past 20 years, it became, in Thailand, in many Southeast Asian countries, they start to privatize a lot more in the 1990s, especially after 1997 economic crisis. It became the opportunity of the state to release the burden, the fiscal burden, to put the burden to university. But does it mean independent? No. High percentage is still rely on the state. Structure remain the same. Power structure remain the same. More regulation to those to those university employees. So as it happened, not just in terms of fiscal control or fiscal relation, but they impose the things that Michael mentioned. You have to publish in what journal. You have to do this, to do that, in order to improve the university ranking. Because university is globalized, now we have to compete with the whole world. I would say that kind of environment, the implication and the concrete consequences in many Southeast Asian countries are not the same as what happened in UK or in Australia. It became, since university or higher education, never independent. That's part of the state function. With the fiscal crisis, economic crisis, they took opportunity to release the burden of the state. University becomes more, they have to find money. But the state didn't release their power, didn't release the control, okay? Now, with that, and with the competition to improve ranking, all of this combined, in the Thai case, make university impose more demands and regulations on faculty, on staff, what they're supposed to do, how they're supposed to behave. I heard that similar process, maybe about lacking about 10 years behind Thailand. Indonesia is the same. I heard that Malaysia is a bit about the same time or more, or a few more years before Thailand. If in the similar fashion, release the burden from the state to impose it on the university itself to force themselves to make more money. Think about what kind of courses, but doesn't release the control in terms of curriculum and many other things. And then with the competition to improve ranking, forcing them, university now, mostly university themselves, putting more demands, forcing those faculty to do more to meet those demands. So they become the new environment for ranking, for neoliberal university, whatever, become the new opportunity and new instrument to control faculty and intellectuals in those higher education even more.
Right.
Even more, I think stronger, but maybe subtler. I mean, not in terms of direct command, but create an environment that they will be under control.
Right.
I think that's bad. What Michael called counter space in Southeast Asia, I like that word.
Thank you.
I would say comes mostly from individual faculties and students. I mean, come from bottom up.
Right.
Not because university even try to become independent.
Right. Yeah.
They try to survive.
Yeah. Let me just invite Mike, because you know what, Tongcha, what you were saying that already happened in the 1920s and 30s in Burma with Rangoon Colonial University, because a small number of native elites were to be processed to become like a low-level or mid-ranking colonial bureaucrats in the British colonial administration. And the counter spaces were created by a handful of progressive-minded English scholars, researchers, and some even bureaucrats, right? And the kind of knowledge that was produced that fed into the anti-British resistance movement, like Marxism, socialism, and other things, right? They didn't come from like reading liberal text, but came from radical literature. But they were outside the space of university, or what might called the state space or state thing. I mean, like Jim's called colonial state. I would say colonial state space, but Mike called colonial state think. And so, how do you move forward? How do you get around this issue of institutional control, curricular control by those who pour money and control the institutional structure?
Well, two things. First of all, I just want to throw in, maybe as a historical aside, that the first Burma Society, and I don't know if it's related to the Britain Burma Society, but the first Burma Society was made up of ex-governors and that kind of thing in London, in the UK. And when university Burmese were coming to the UK to do university education, they were supposed to watch over them individually and make sure they didn't wind up in bad circles. So there was that control from the very beginning. The university strikes in 1920, when they set up the Rangoon University, they wanted to impose really directly this colonial state education, and not even in Burmese. And of course, Burmese took to the streets on that and set up all kinds of protest universities and so on. So universities, Burma has been from the colonial period, very vigorous in setting up these counter spaces, right? To get to the more recent present, though, to raise this issue about money interest, what I thought was interesting about the Yale-NUS situation was, from reports at least, it sounds like they built up a big endowment from all kinds of donors in the U.S. and in Singapore. Evidently, the decision to close the ALNUS was made without, they're consulting them now to see whether they want to keep their endowment with the school. But in this particular case, and this goes back to the comment Tongchai made, where I think where Singapore, it may not be so direct, it may be more indirect kind of state control. This is where this comes in. In this case, the big money that was behind the school, the non-state money, that wasn't listened to. And this was all made by a state, a branch of the state, the executive of National University of Singapore. So it's not the money interest. In actuality, probably the moneyed interest would probably be more in favor of encouraging counter spaces in Singapore. But I guess what the deal was is that Yale-NUS, the Singapore government, did not want to fund it. They wanted it to be on its own. But as we've seen with the closure, they wanted to still maintain full control. So I think in practice, it wasn't different than the rest of Southeast Asia. It's just that they do it very differently. And part of it is, in Singapore, the state's been more effective in affecting this kind of Gramscian self-regulation. So people hold themselves back, and you see this behavior amongst academics, even Western academics who have been at Singapore, National University of Singapore for a long time. They hold themselves back from saying different things. So there's less of a danger. But in the particular things that are emerging in Yale and US, those put up red flags, because things like instructing people, doing a workshop on protest placards, having a course on how to have dissent and have yourself actually have an impact on Singaporean politics, that was dangerous. So I think that's that's part of the difference we see here. It's the same thing happening across the board in Southeast Asia. It's just in Singapore it wound up manifesting itself differently.
Yeah. Let me invite Tongchai. Tongchai, you talk about control of the curricula, and also I think Mike also talk about STEM, science, technology, engineering, medicine, right? These are supposed to be like key subjects that contribute to economy, the growth, development, and all that. But the word education is essentially about enlightening minds, right? Enlightened mind. Universities are places where young minds are to be nurtured, so that they expand and they grow. And so what is this, very foundational function of this institution we call universities, or, other institutions like schools? Well, what happened to the primary function, which is to nurture the young mind in society intellectually, if you will? What happened to their mission? If we are pursuing this neoliberal economic agenda, or authoritarian political control that happens, and that has been happening across Asia. Tongchai, what do you think? Well, why do universities exist if they don't encourage and nurture minds to grow?
Sorry, I try to adjust a bit because I avoid the sunlight. Zani, Do you think there has ever been liberal education in Southeast Asia?
No, no, no.
You talk about what you talk is mainly basically liberal education, right? I don't mean that it's completely non-existent. No, no, no. There is no such a thing. I don't mean that it's completely controlled. By the way, what I say control for many minutes before this, there's no such a thing as absolute or complete. But I will talk about fundamentally. You talk about liberal education, you talk about philosophy of university. I'm not sure in history of Western university, I'm not even sure it's all the time liberal education, but let's say in the past century or so, it's mainly liberal education, or at least in terms of how to say, what a university is, even when it was not liberal. The subject is the subject that we call liberal art today. Western University in history, even when it was not liberal. The subject or the basic of university that grow up before professional schools dominate today, because professional school is 19th and 20th century. Before that, it was the subject that we today, we call liberal art. When we talk about Southeast Asian higher education as colonial education, what does it mean? If you look at history of higher education in Southeast Asia, no exception Thailand, Burma, or Singapore, liberal education was not its main philosophy. Liberal education is not its mission. Again, Michael said it, I said many times, it produced a workforce, especially to serve the colonial bureaucracy.
Right.
Look at concretely, what are the major faculty or departments? They all apply, they're all professional, they're all kind of useful knowledge.
Yeah. Land survey is one of the key ones.
Useful.
Agricultural
You
colleges.
understand me? Useful in the sense of tangible usefulness. Now, because we can say to the liberal art is useful, of course, useful for the brain, but I don't mean that. I mean, legacy of higher education, of colonial education, because higher education in Southeast Asia are mostly was from the start built up on those useful knowledge. Not liberal
But
mission.
useful for whom? And to
That's
whose
it.
benefit?
I know. That's what I mean. Do you
Yeah.
understand me?
Yeah.
Not liberal education. Liberal art is important because they teach people how to know how to compose letters. They teach people how to know letters. But they are, I'm not sure in every country, but as far as I know, again, Thailand, Indonesia, Philippines, I'm not sure, Malaysia, Singapore too. They turn more liberal art in lately. Legacies of colonial education because they want to produce accountants, lawyers, social workers, and liberal art means basically clerks, people who know letters,
Right.
to serve the government offices. That's why the actual, I would call, I don't know what to call, but let's say actual liberal art, strong liberal art in Thailand, in many other countries are mostly weak throughout colonial education. I put that's why I mentioned the article on Asian studies across academies, because I discussed about colonial education to some extent in that article. I would say modern higher education, it does, sorry, I would say it again. It doesn't mean that those countries did not have or never have the thing compatible to Western liberal arts subject. They have. But the beginning of colonial higher education throughout Southeast Asia is separate. They did not connect with the indigenous liberal arts knowledge, liberal art like knowledge. They belong to temples. They belong to something else. They didn't connect. They create universities, modern university, modern higher education to serve the colonies, to serve the colonial administration. That's why liberal arts, so-called liberal arts in the West right now, from the mission to the curriculum, in my opinion, has been weak, because the indigenous one was not developed further to higher education. The higher education put it as secondary, put it like a back burner, backseat of higher education, because they produce people who are useful for colonial administration. So this is the environment. This is different. So you talk about liberal mission, I think, wow, that's very much Western. So when you talk Western hegemony, you talk about Western domination, in my opinion, I may have different opinion. I have different ideas on that. To the extent that many people call my anti-university piece, call my comments on university that I'm a kind of pro-Western, too much Western. I think it is not direct that, because in many cases, such as in Thailand, if university and the country become more Western a bit more, I would say it's beneficial, it's good. It's not that bad, because the state try to control too much. If they try to liberalize university a bit more in terms of power structure, in terms of control, it would be better. I would welcome that.
I mean, Toncha, the issue is, the intellectual freedom, the freedom to pursue what individuals considered, truth. That has to transcend West or East or Buddhism or Christianity. You know what I mean?
But the point is that actually in practice today, the control is not there because university become too much Western, but because university become still too much state control, authoritarian. They take opportunity of the neoliberalism and Western demand for ranking whatever to control even more. Yeah. So I get in short, to answer your where is liberal mission? The liberal mission has never been mission of higher education in Thailand, in many countries in Southeast Asia from the beginning, and it has not yet been. By the way, a little footnote: when NUS start Yale NUS, liberal arts, Yale NUS liberal arts college, right? Apart from, putting aside all those criticism from Yale, from NUS, whatever. One thing came to my mind at that point. Wow, this is bucking the trend, because everywhere they go STEMs, they don't go liberal art. Yeah. So at that time, I would say I cheer Yale and US, because at least on the single aspect that they try to create liberal art education in Southeast Asia, which I don't think it is a mission. I think it is secondary in higher education throughout Southeast Asia.
Well, apparently the Singapore found it rather threatening and dangerous.
That's it.
Sorry, Micah, you want to come in?
Oh, I was just going to say, I agree in essence with Thongchai's points, but I would have depicted them a little bit differently. I don't see promoting these counter spaces in universities, or at least preventing the state from closing them down, as essentially pro-Western. I think we have to look at the university as what it is, as an extension of, a Western aspect of the modern state defined by the West. And so you can still be decolonizing and be in favor of restricting the state's control over freedom within the university.
Yeah. I mean, like universities as instruments. The question is, whose interest, should these institutions serve? But I think this issue of control of universities and the entire domain or process of knowledge production from external forces other than the workers or knowledge producers in the institutions, we have in UK and US as well. I mean, say for instance, economic forces in the West are extremely powerful, and now like that we haven't even talk about the role of China and some other like extremely wealthy Gulf states throwing their money at say like Cambridge or Oxford or LSE and attempting to control what kind of publication should be allowed and what not. You know what I mean? Like just 2 years ago, the China funding was basically interfering with the Cambridge University Press, books on China, right? So we have this here as well. But I think the situation in Southeast Asia, what compounds this is like, the general lack of, intellectually vibrant civil society that push back.
Well, that's a problem. That's the problem is I don't want to blame PRC too much. It's too easy to blame PRC for everything goes wrong. It's a problem with the Southeast Asian universities themselves and the Southeast Asian states themselves.
Yeah, how do we move this forward? Like we've got extremely powerful autocratic states running these like ex-colonial institutions of higher education. We've got a society where elites are no longer or are not prepared to push, or to democratize thinking, basically, among the, in the case of like Russia protest. I mean, Tongchai was extremely vocal with his writing, scathing about Bangkok elite, calling the, democratizers from the margins of Thai society as like unworthy of votes. I mean, the Russia protesters come from rural areas that they are considered quote unquote country bumpkins, right? And they're not educated in the West or Bangkok. And so what do? We've got these powerful institutions, the states and then civil society, right? Civil society is not necessarily good or bad. We like to think it's good, but in the case of like, Thailand, the yellow shirt, and in the case of pro-military sectors within Burma or even Singaporean citizenry, right? They are not really fighting for the intellectual freedom. How do we get around these powerful forces?
Well, I don't know. I don't know if it's for us to force anything on Southeast Asia. It has to come from Southeast Asian societies themselves, and but I think that, and the other problem here is, and this is where PRC does come in. In the old days, Cold War, right?
Yeah.
We would have had U.S. and other governments. Now, they did a lot of bad things, but they could also put pressure on Southeast Asians to at least adhere, pay lip service to democracy and everything else. But yeah, that didn't always work. But nobody's going to do anything now to counter authoritarianism because of standoff with the PRC. I think that the most that can be done is to put enough pressure on society, on states, in terms for state funding and this kind of thing, aid and other things, trade, to avoid sanctions, to put enough pressure on them just to allow enough space for students to organize their own counter spaces within universities. And I think that's the best we can do until societies as a whole are able to control their states more. And that's not going to happen immediately.
I agree. Let's say I can't think of anything in the big picture of things. University is still not higher. Higher education is not very high on the agenda, either for the state or for the democracy movement. And I think it's understandable. So let's say all I can say is that democratization, the fight for democracy is the same process. But even that, suppose there's a moment that suppose there will be a moment for democratization, let's say in the country of Southeast Asia. I hope that university would not fall off the agenda. I would say people would take opportunity. Of course, by that time, if it happens, it depends on people, not just civil society. I mean, narrower than that, it depends on people in the university community. Try to make themselves try to make the institutions more independent from the state. But I doubt, I'm not sure that would happen. But let's say for sure, for now, all we can say is that it's almost impossible to take university to separate it from the state's control under the authoritarian environment. But having said that, keep in mind, again, what Michael called counter space. What I'm also interested in, somehow, what I call control, all kind of things, all the structures. Universities, higher education has been the space for protest, for counter space throughout Southeast Asia, from independence movement, right?
Yeah.
Right. So I kind of interesting in the sense, it's interesting in the sense of why. Maybe education environment, maybe the youth culture, maybe all kind of things. The state has never had full control of university either students or faculty. And somehow the rebellious mind in almost everywhere in Southeast Asia, this is what Harry Bender observed since 1950, 60.
Yeah.
Somehow academics or intellectuals in Southeast Asia engaged in social and political issues than in the West. Right?
Right.
Why? He tried to explain. I think they are even 50, 60 years after that, still need more explanation. Somehow it has been, despite the full control, it has been a counter space. Of course, not all the time, but on and off. But basically, we can find counter space in the university, in higher education, in Southeast Asia. We can find in university higher education more than other spaces. I think somehow control never absolute, control never fully work. They just, those individuals have to know how to operate. But to the extent that they can make university independent from the state, I doubt.
Well, of course, like we will not be able to take the instruments from the state, as you both mentioned, the states use universities as vehicles and instruments for their own agenda. Yeah, so perhaps we should have a sequel to this conversation and bring in other like-minded scholars who want to expand this counter space that Michael's coinage from across Southeast Asia
and different gender and women as well in the next one.
Yes, of course, and different geographic diversity. So both of you, I thank you very, very much, and we are at the end of our discussion, and so have the rest of the